Fernando. Thank you very much, Fernando, and also for Leonardo Energy for hosting us today. We're very happy that we can do this collaboration again. My name is Lena Kitzing, and I'm Associate Professor and Head of Section at the Technical University of Denmark at the Department of Wind Energy. And I have been leading the work package where we did the work on financing in this this project ORIS-2, which is actually coming to an end. So we finalized our work in this work package, and this is us showing the results to the world. So I'm very happy to have the full panel of speakers with me today who have been working with us on these analysis and results. And we will have a first introduction by everyone. So please go on.
Yes, thanks, Lena. So my name is Mark, and I'm a PhD student at the Technical University of Denmark, where I am working on the topic of how auctions impact financing conditions for renewables for my PhD. That's it. Moira?
Sorry, yes. My name is Moira Jimeno, and I'm working at the Clarion as a senior project manager for renewable energy policies and financing structure of renewable energy. And I led here the survey, and the results of the survey is what I will present today.
Hello, my name is Barbara Breitschow, and I'm senior researcher at Fraunhofer Institute for System and Innovation Research. And I've been involved in this work and analysis of this project, and it's also part of my research, or one part of my research area. Thank you. Anna.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Anna Amaso. I work at Guidehouse, a consultancy company, and I am joining you from Berlin today. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. So now you've met the panel, and I will lead the webinar into the presentations by a first introduction of the project. So if we can switch to the start. So ORIS is a EU-funded research project, and the abbreviation stands for Auctions for Renewable Energy Support. When we started our work in about 6 years ago with the first ORIS project, it was actually the first dedicated European research project on auctions. And then we did bring that to a successful conclusion, and we continued the work almost in the same consortium in the second project, which is now coming to an end. So you can see here everyone who was involved in the project. And if we go to the next slide, you can see what we're trying to do in the project. We have three distinct objectives. The first is to generate knowledge, new insights, and also communicate them about auctions for renewable energy support, about their applicability and their performance, and especially how to design auctions in an effective and efficient way. And then the second objective that we have is to provide tailor-made policy support for different types of auction implications. We actually do collaborate with policymakers as well within the project. And then also the third objective is to facilitate knowledge exchange between stakeholders, policymakers, between different levels, national, international level, but also other stakeholders, bringing together bidders and the interested public and also designers and auctioneers. So that's what we do. On the next slide, I thought it would be good to start in the beginning with a little bit of terminology. So what are auctions? And also you might have heard the use of the word tender instead. So auctions are very basically the sale or the procurement of products or services through a competitive bidding procedure. So that's what we're looking into, a competitive bidding procedure to select products or services, either when you sell them or when you want to procure them. And in renewable energy support auctions, we talk about procurement auctions because the government typically wants to procure new renewable energy production. And then what they're offering is, I think if we go back one more, yeah, what they're offering is a support payment. The word tender is used very much, also in policy design. In our understanding, it's a subcategory of auctions. So tenders typically have multi-criteria selection in an auction, a competitive bidding procedure. Oftentimes they are used a bit interchangeably, so oftentimes meant the same. So if we have a look into how this procurement could look like on the next slide, yes. So I said that already. Typically in renewable energy auction, the government procures renewable energy through those tenders, auctions, and then makes contracts with the winners to install a certain capacity of renewable energy or to deliver a certain volume. So what the bidders are actually competing on when they enter the auction is the right to receive support payments or to enter direct power purchase agreements, depending on the market, for this renewable energy. And the winners, because it's a competitive process, are selected based on the lowest required support level that they need. So that's the typical bid. How much support do you need per megawatt hour, per unit of electricity? And these bids are then ranked, as you can see on the right side. Each point of the on the blue line is a bid by a bidder, and they are ranked. And then typically there is a certain res volume of projects that can be awarded, and everything below that, those are the winners of the auction. And then there is a certain price. Can be a uniform price. It can also be a pay as bid dedicated prices for each winner. So this is auction. That's what we talk about when we talk about auctions. Then the second part I would like to show, if we go further, because here now we are going into a specific topic in auctions, and this whole webinar is about financing of these auctions and how auction designs affect financing. So this was a whole work package in the work that we've been doing in ORS2, as I mentioned before. And for this, the second terminology that I would like to just introduce is, what do we mean by financing and financing conditions? Oh, sorry, the terminology comes in the next slide. So here, the first step that I wanted to show is what kind of analysis or activities have we done. So when we talk about impacts of auctions on financing, we look into the factors that might impact these financing conditions. So we have had a more conceptual analysis around what kind of factors could impact financing conditions. And we could actually see that there are many different factors impacting those conditions in different ways, both positive and negative. What we then did is we looked into financing. We completed a financing survey to get quantitative data, and this is what Moira is going to show you. I gave a little bit of a glimpse from this picture. Then based on the survey results that we got, we made an econometric analysis, and this is what Barbara is going to talk to you about. And then also we did some cash flow simulations to see what these different financing conditions mean for projects and also for support cost needs. And this is what Mark is going to show you. And then finally, based on all of this knowledge and these insights that we got, both from the qualitative, conceptual, qualitative survey results, but also from our quantitative modeling, we derived some understanding and some recommendations about how auctions could be designed so that they actually create a low risk financing environment. And this is what Anna is going to show you in the end. So when we talk about financing, what do we mean? It is very important to look into financing for auctions, and we look mostly into several options. One of the major financing conditions is the cost of capital. So the weighted average cost of capital, and that means how expensive is the money that I use for investing in renewables. And many people know that renewables need a lot of investment. Actually, the share of capital investment, upfront investment for renewables is much higher than for conventional fossil fuel-based generation, because we don't have any fuel. So most of the costs are actually spent in the beginning. And that means that the financing of those investments also have a big impact on the overall economics of those projects. And you can see that here on the left side, on the y-axis, you have the LCOE, so the overall generation cost, and at different WACC levels, so at different levels of cost of capital. So you can see going from a 2% WACC to a 10% WACC is a huge difference in the overall project economics. So at 10% is already more than half of the overall cost. That's the financing. If we break it down a little bit, the cost of capital has different elements in it. There is the cost of debt. That's when you go to the bank and lend money. So a loan, that has a certain cost, and then there is cost of equity, which is coming from the shareholders. They put money into it. And then sometimes there is a premium based on risk as well. So these are all elements of the cost of capital. And also the share between the two makes a difference. And all of these elements are impacted by different auction designs, and they can actually change the economics of these renewable projects quite a lot. So how do they do that? This is my last slide, the next one, and this is showing the lifetime of a single project, going from pre-development into project development, construction, operations. And there are different risks related to auctions, and all of those risks, they could impact financing as well. So in the very early stage, auctions can, for example, impact planning risk, because we know it's a competitive process, and if developers are not used to that, so there is an added risk for volume control. For example, there's auction volumes, there's auction frequency that need to be adhered to. During the project development phase, you have a different risk, qualification risk, which means can this project qualify to actually participate in the auction? What is the timing around that? This has something to do with the permitting, the pre-qualification criteria, and things like that. Then at the auction day, there is an allocation risk. The projects, there will be projects most often which are not winning the auction and losing out. So this is something that auctions introduce into the development process. And then after financial close, auctions often are introduced with penalties to deliver at a certain stage. It's a contractual relationship. So there is non-compliance risk for penalties if there is a delay. And after that stage, obviously, depending on the remuneration scheme, there will also be revenue risk related to the operation, so how the support is being paid out. So there is different elements of these risks, and we have been looking into all of those. So I hope that has given you an overall picture of not only what we mean with auctions, but also what we mean with financing, and then what we mean with the different risks and at what stages in the auction, in the project lifetime we're talking about. Thank you. I'll give the word to Maura.
Yes. Thank you, Lena, for this very nice overview and introduction. I will now present the results from the EU survey we did on renewable energy financing conditions and cost of capital. So yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, I divided the presentation in four main parts. So in the first part, I will present the weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, main results that we got from the survey for 2019 and the overtime development between 2014 and 2019. Then I will present the same for cost of debt, so the main results for 2019 and the overtime development, and the same for cost of equity, main results for the same year and the overtime development. After all, I will give the main conclusions or insight from the survey. So to start, I will present now the results, as I said, for the WACC for 2019 on wind onshore. I want to clarify some aspects before. As you can see in the map here, we present all the results for all the EU countries, and they are all mainly on wind onshore, because even though we conducted the survey on the three technologies, so to get data on wind onshore, PV, and wind offshore, I have to say that the most complete data we got was on wind onshore. And that's why we built our presentation and our database and reports on the wind onshore. So the data is mainly on wind onshore, except but for two countries, which are Slovakia and Hungary, because there, as you can see there in the map, we didn't have any wind onshore data, and that is why the data is for PV, because of the missing investments on wind onshore in those countries. Well, the results, I mean, one of the main results we got from the survey for the WACC is that there is still a gap between all the member states. As you can see, the dark green represents the lower WACC, and the red color represents the higher WACCs. So we have these differences, especially between the western part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe, especially southeastern countries and the Baltic countries, where the WACC is still quite high. However, the good news is that, please, next slide, is that if we see the development of the WACC between 2014 and 2019, we found that there has been a dramatic decrease of the WACC in most of the countries between those years, and the gap is narrowing. So if we see here on the graph, we can see that, for example, the Spanish and the Greek case are impressive. In the Spanish case, we had that in 2014, there was still a wide gap between the WACC and from Spain and the WACC from the EU average, and that in 2019 this WACC is this gap is really narrow, and Spain is even below the average of the EU. So that's really impressive and positive. And for Greece, we can see this also dramatic decrease of the WACC through the years. And we see mainly for that development, for that decrease of the WACC, we see then mainly that the reason is on the two main components of the WACC. As Lena said, the two main components of the WACC are the cost of debt and the cost of equity. So the decrease of the WACC can be explained because of the decrease that we could find in the cost of debt and the cost of equity. So I will now present the map that shows the cost of debt for results for 2019. So many countries have now, or in 2019, had an average cost of debt that is lower than 2%. So that's a really good news. Mainly because in the map, you can see that are many countries colored with the dark green, stating that we have a very quite low cost of debt for most of them. And of course, we still have these differences between the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Europe, as I said before on the WACC map. So this kind of reflect what I showed on the WACC. Yes, the reason for this decrease on the cost of debt, I will explain it in the next slide. is because of the development of the costs from 2014 and 2019. We could find that there was, or there has been, a big correlation between the cost of debt and the interest rates in the Eurozone. So this can be seen in these two graphs. I mean, that represent the Spanish and the Greek cases, which are again the most impressive cases. You can see that the interest rate has been decreasing, and this decrease has somehow been accompanied by the cost of debt decrease. And here, although we don't have the German graph representing, I can say that even though in Germany the gap was not that wide in 2014, of course, between the cost of debt and the interest rates, there is still has been a decreasing gap, and it has narrowed even more this difference. This improves that there is a convergence between both the cost of debt and the interest rates in Europe. And the second reason for this decrease of the cost of debt is that the international flow of capital. So here is very important in Europe, the role played by the European Investment Bank with the investment in renewable energies in Europe, and also some investment that did Germany in Europe, especially, for example, in the Germany in Greece, and the German investments in Greece. But also not only in Europe, but also very important where the investments, international capital that comes from abroad, from outside Europe, mainly from Canada and the US. This has also led to lower the cost of debt, because here the correlation between the low cost of debt is that this international investor usually had access to lower costs when they raised the debt to finance their renewable energy investments. And now I will present in the next slide the results we got from the survey for the cost of equity for 2019. So as you can see in the map, the 65% of the country have a lower cost of debt than 10%. So that is also good news here. And also we can see, as we could see in the cost of debt and in the WACC, that the main difference are between the Western and the Eastern countries again, especially Southeastern countries, which are the riskier countries within the Eurozone, and that's why they have the higher cost of equity. So the riskier countries usually have also higher cost of equities. Yes, then we can see for the next slide that I can also show here the development of the cost of equity between 2014 and 2019. And we can see this trend this decreased trend, as well as that is reflected in the WACC. As I said, the two main components here reflect what I showed first in the WACC. And the main explanation for that is the emergence of new market players that are now, or now or in the last year are now interested in greening their portfolios and invest in renewable energy due to some external pressure. When I am speaking about new market players, I am referring to other kind of the typical renewable energy investors, so other investors, and other investors are energy utilities, but not only energy utilities, but what is also more impressive for us, or more surprising, are this new kind of investor that are not related to energy, like for example the IT sector or the heavy industries, which are also now interested to green their portfolios. So companies like Google or IKEA have a pressure to invest in renewable energy or green their portfolios, because mainly because of the use of these so-called environmental, social, and governance factors that are used by the international credit rating agencies, and that's put an additional pressure to them, because their business position could be somehow damaged if these rating agencies state that that this company are exposed to some climate risks, so financing risks, and this this poses a pressure to these companies. The other pressure comes, of course, from the international climate policy, so especially the Paris Agreement and the EU Green Deal. And within the EU Green Deal in Europe, very important was also the EU sustainability taxonomy, especially the regulation through the regulation 2020-852 on the framework to facilitate sustainable investment. And last but not least, we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that was created by the Financial Stability Board to enhance transparency on climate-related investments. So all these factors explain this decrease this late decrease on the cost of equity. In the next slide, I will present, the main conclusions we could drive from this survey. So I didn't say, but the survey that we conducted were more than 90 interviews. So it was a quite extended survey that we did. And in this survey, we found out that the WACC have been decreasing, and of course, also then the cost of debt and the cost of equity, which are the two main components of the WACC. The main explanation for this decrease on the cost of debt is the huge role of interest rates and the international capital spillovers, or this flow of capital that I explained before. And for the cost of equity is the emergence of the new investors that have now different interests than their own traditional businesses, but are now also interested in other businesses like renewable energy or other green investments, and the emergence of new business models like the PPAs. Here, when I say new business models, I'm referring as well to the power purchase agreements that have a momentum now running in parallel with the state-supported auctions models, so the more traditional auctions models, and now with the private PPAs. These are all good news because the lower cost of capital are a positive sign for a further renewable energy development, and this will allow them to reach the energy and climate goals even faster. Thank you very much. It is now for now. I will now bring the floor to Barbara.
Thank you very much, Moria. We conducted a quantitative analysis to confirm some of our observations, assumptions, or impressions we get from the data Moria just presented, and wanted to get answers to our question. On the next slide, you see on what we are focusing and what we would like to know. We applied two steps. First, we ask ourselves, what do we observe and what do we know already? What do we not know yet? And what is our main question? So what did we observe, or what are we observing or knowing? We know that there are diverse risks that increase cost of capital. We know that the cost of capital varies significantly between countries, reflected through the different risks in those countries. And we also observe and know that in some countries, albeit they have very favorable natural conditions for renewable energies, the generation cost of renewable electricity is not significantly lower than in countries with less favorable natural conditions. So we conclude, or somehow assume, that high cost of capital obviously outweighs favorable generation conditions for renewables. So the question then was, or the next step was, what do we not know yet when we look at auctions? So we didn't know, or we don't know yet, or haven't known, whether the implementation of auctions entails additional risks for the investors. We did not ask for the specific design elements and their impact on the risk, but for the implementation of auction itself. Further, we did not know which additional factors and dominating risks really have impact on the cost of capital, and to what degree auction and those other factors also affect the cost of capital. So our question was, do auctions and remuneration schemes, which go together with auctions, affect the risks and hence the cost of capital? And if no, what other factors would have that been? That may be an additional question. So on the next slide, please, you see how we approach to answer this question. First of all, we differentiated the risks that we observed by their levels. We identified, or we defined 3 levels of risk. One is the country or the macro level risk, where we said these are not specific risks for renewables, but general risk at the macro country level. They are reflected through the bond rate, government bond rates, through social acceptance of renewables, through indicators reflecting political stability or the economic development. Second level we looked at is the sector or the meso level. That's the area where all renewable energies belongs to, so renewable sector somehow. This includes policies like the remuneration schemes, the introduction of auction, but also the experiences the country had with the renewable energy deployment, then the long-term policies applied in those countries, and the capital market conditions, financing sector in that sense. And at a project or micro level, we looked at various project-specific features like the technology, the type of investor, or the type of financing, and natural conditions at that location. As data, we used, first of all, the auction database of AURES2, then the WAC database of AURES2. These are the data that has just been presented by Moira. And also, of course, we use additional sources like Eurostat, World Bank, Energy Commission reports on energy renewables, policies, etc., and the European Central Bank data. We set up an econometric model where the dependent variable was the WAC, and the independent variables were all the factors at the 3 levels we have identified. Next slide, please. There you see what our findings are. We find that at a macro level, not surprisingly, by the way, the dominating factor of cost of capital has been reflected through the government bonds and the economic growth. So the country risk is one major factor, or a very dominant factor that really has a huge impact on that WAC for renewable energies projects. Second, on the sector level, we have some impacts on cost of capital, namely the implementation of auctions and support policies. We learned that policies that reduce market risk exposure has a slightly cost-reducing impact. And we also learned that the introduction and implementation of auction has not increased the cost of capital. We also learn, but these are only with a low significance, that it seems that that increasing experience with auctions and also with renewables somehow leads to learning effects, thus also positively affecting cost of capitals, meaning that there's slightly decrease. At the project level, we do see that the choice of technology between wind onshore and PV does not matter. So the WAC does not differ between solar and wind onshore, but between wind offshore in combination, especially with economic growth, there's a difference. So wind offshore is more expensive with respect to cost of capital than the PV and wind onshore. Unfortunately, we did not find any other factor at the project level to affect the WAC. So neither the type of investor, no counterpart risks, no project structure, etc., has been significant. But probably this is also due to the number of observations, and also that we were not able to differentiate very strictly between different types of project. For example, project structure or financing structure. We only applied, for example, project financing or balancing financing. So these are our findings. Macro level, the dominant one, sector level auction. The implementation of auction has no negative impact on the WAC, but rather the opposite, it has slightly positive impact. So we are looking for your comments, and thank you for listening. And I hand over to my colleague, Mac now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. I will now present the result of the cash flow simulations that we did. So in specific, we looked at, by using cash flow modeling, how much can EU countries save in support costs by reducing risks for renewables. And we then tried to connect this to potential measures to de-risk auction designs, which Anna will explain later on. So essentially, what we looked at was the de-risking potentials in the countries. So based on the data that Moira has presented earlier and based on the survey, we looked at how much could countries save if they move their cost of capital and individual aspects of cost of capital that Lena explained earlier from the average level to basically the minimum surveyed or best-in-class level. And this included looking at scenarios that include looking at all financing conditions, improving all financing conditions at once at the same time, then all debt financing conditions, then just cost of debt, cost of equity, the debt service coverage ratio, and the loan tenor or the loan duration. But besides this, we wanted to see what would be the effect of changing other investment variables. So we also looked into the effects of capital costs or investment costs or capex, the effects of capacity factors, operational cost, and also the effect of changing electricity price assumptions. So the first thing that we find is essentially, as you can see on this graph, well, actually first to explain this graph a little bit. So the graph shows basically the relationship between support costs and the average WACC in the countries. And in the yellow dots, you can see countries that have a two-sided contract for difference. In the blue one, you can see countries that have a sliding premium or a one-sided contract for difference. And then in the black, you can see countries that have a fixed premium support payment scheme. And then here on the x-axis, you can see the support costs in euros per megawatt hour. And on the y-axis, you can see the WACC values. So essentially what we find here is that countries that have higher WACCs in general have also higher support costs. So, and then countries that have lower WACCs, they in general have lower support costs. However, what we also find is essentially that there are some outliers. So for instance, if you look here, this is the onshore wind in Germany. And here what you can see is essentially that although Germany has the lowest recorded WACC level among these countries, it basically has a very high support cost, indicating that WACC is not the only element that affects support costs. And this is because of the, actually mostly because of the electricity price assumptions that we took. So we took the electricity price assumptions here that were valid for up to 2020. And essentially the difference between those electricity prices that we assumed and what the projects would need to be financially sustainable leads to, in Germany, such larger support costs. Then, in general, what we find in terms of the saving potentials is that essentially de-risking debt financing would bring the biggest benefit. It would bring a relatively higher benefit than just de-risking equity financing. However, if you look at the other variables that we also analyzed, de-risking debt financing is actually very similar to for instance, using an electricity price scenario where the electricity price increases by 2% per year, instead of a scenario that we took, which was an increase of just 1% per year. And Also, support costs depend on other conditions. So for instance, the capacity factors, they have a very large impact, but also the capex values. So the general conclusion is that it's not only up to the financing conditions, but it's also up to these other elements in the investment models that also have an impact on support costs. So in general, the conclusions of this are that essentially since the largest benefits in terms of financing on de-risking would be from de-risking debt financing, and debt financing depends on to a larger extent on the operational phase of the projects and in the revenues that the project receives. We then recommend policymakers to de-risk those revenues by introducing revenue stabilization mechanisms such as the two-sided contract for difference remuneration scheme that stabilizes revenues. Then also when we compare also these countries that have different remuneration scheme types, we also see that actually having then a CFD does not in itself guarantee though that the country or that the project will have a lower cost of capital. And this is because actually we find, similarly to what Barbara has mentioned, that actually these macro level elements play a very large role. And we also think that in the end, country risk is an element that actually plays probably the most significant role in the final cost of capital and the variation in the cost of capital that we see across Europe. On the other hand, de-risking cost of equity would have a lesser impact. There has been a lot of talk about de-risking auction designs for certain players, for instance, for smaller actors, by, for instance, decreasing the bid bond level or by letting them realize the project in a longer time period and so on and so forth. This analysis finds that actually implementing measures that would affect the phase of the project where equity is mostly involved would not actually bring the biggest saving for society in the end. So, so essentially, we then, from that aspect, recommend policymakers to only do this if cost efficiency is not the primary reason, or if there are some other measures or goals that they want to achieve. However, obviously, by being very cautious not to affect the auction design so that and to make the auction design inefficient. And then finally, we also find that other market conditions have a very large impact on support costs, and essentially, and specifically, we find that electricity price expectations have a relatively big impact. And so that is it for my segment, and I will now hand it over to Anna.
Thank you, Mac. Hello, everyone. Next, we will discuss how to create a low-risk auction support framework based on the results from the survey, empirical and cash flow analysis, as well as practical insights we've gathered from supporting countries with auction design in several countries in Europe and also outside. Next slide. We'll mainly talk about a summary of design elements that help address risks along the project development cycle, including those related to the auction more directly, as well as those that more broadly affect project revenues. Next slide. As my colleague Lena explained in her introduction, there are several risks along the project development cycle. This is a slightly different version of the graph on the slide, but what you see is essentially that risks such as the risk that a bidder doesn't qualify or allocation risk, happen in earlier project development stages, whereas non-compliance risk has to do with the risk that a bidder pays a penalty or loses an award because of delayed or failed project realization, and revenue or market exposure risks affect rather the operations stage. Next slide. Our first design element has to do with the question on how much capacity or electricity to auction and how often. Our analysis shows that as auctions become more established, meaning as there are more learning effects by having more auction rounds and substantial volumes, the cost of capital can decrease. Our recommendation here is therefore to, it's rather a common sense recommendation if you think about it, but to auction volumes that are sufficiently high to ensure participation rates, but also adjust them to the expected level of project supply from the market. Also, an auction schedule and holding them at a regular frequency can enable your project pipeline to develop and allow bidders to participate with projects that were not awarded in previous rounds. And this way also address allocation risk. However, as always, it's important to give policymakers flexibility to adjust volumes to avoid strong price fluctuations in cases where the expected level of project supply is lower than in previous rounds. Next slide. A question relating to auction volumes during the auction procedure is what happens if the supply of bids does not exceed the auction volume or only slightly exceeds it. In this case, the auctioneer may choose to adapt the auction volume to the observed supply and only award a fraction of the volume that it intended, or in other words, apply endogenous rationing. While this measure can increase competition in the short term, it also increases planning risk. Therefore, endogenous rationing should be avoided and rather adjust the auction volume for the next rounds. However, if the endogenous rationing must be applied, it is important that the conditions and the size of the volume adjusted is clearly stated before the auction. That is, that bidders are are aware of the rules of the adjustment. Next slide, please. Well, as my colleague Mac mentioned, we also looked into what happens, the link with material prequalification, bid bonds, and penalties. And material prequalifications refer to documentation such as obtaining a building permit or evidence that there is sufficient grid connection capacity for a project. And they all intend to ensure that bidders are serious and that they gain relevant insights on project site conditions, costs, and also local regulations before the auction. All of this is intended to ensure that the project is built on time. And as part of our analysis, we see that while the intuition might be that relaxing these design elements could reduce, for instance, the cost of equity, actually, there is no effect that we observe in terms of reducing bid levels or the level of support. But instead, it may create even unwanted effects, such as increasing the risk that projects are not built on time or that projects fail. Therefore, the recommendation here is to set them carefully so as to allow for the benefits of a more reliable project realization and allowing bidders to get knowledge, to know the costs of the project before they place a bid, rather than just relaxing them. Next slide. Now we will focus on risks that affect project revenue, and this can be the case due to price volatility in electricity markets, which can lead to unsecured revenues that, of course, you need to pay your debt and debt service as well as your dividends. We actually see that while, as my colleague Max said, the key thing is cost of capital is mainly driven by country risks. However, we do see that support schemes that have some form of revenue stabilization mechanisms, meaning those that design the support level to vary according to the level of market prices, can do a good job at shielding investors from unsecured revenues. And we see that both what we call one-sided or two-sided feeding premiums can work well. I think that the choice is rather a matter of policy preferences, as well as local market electricity prices and capacity factors. Next slide, please. Okay, there's a little bit of a distortion on the graph, but that's okay. In the remainder of the slides, I want to focus on risks that also affect revenues, but that are largely relevant for contracting parties of the energy community. And one of those questions has to do with the conversion of fixed tariffs that could be awarded at the beginning of the auction when there's not an electricity market. And those feed-in tariffs or those fixed tariffs are later converted to a feed-in premium once a electricity market is introduced. And this is relevant for these countries because with the exception of Serbia, there are currently no electricity markets, but they are being planned. And they are thinking about a good way of attracting investment, but at the same time ensuring that there is that renewable generation is also compatible with the market, with the electricity market. So we do see that, of course, a conversion can introduce risks because there is an uncertainty that can be heavily discounted by bidders, because at the time of bidding, you don't know what the level of market prices of the electricity market would be. However, this is more of a practical insight. So when a conversion of this fixed tariff to a feed-in premium is necessary, it's important to mitigate potential negative impacts by defining a conversion event clearly, for instance, by making it clear how the market will be deemed ready, under which criteria. Also by, also by taking the level of the fixed tariff as the strike price of a two-sided feed-in premium, and also considering allocating partial responsibility for electricity imbalances to producers if there is no liquid intraday market in place yet. Next slide, please. Also relevant for countries in the energy community are issues that can affect project revenues and that have to do with off-taker risk, either because of a dispatch risk, meaning that the power plant is not dispatched by the off-taker of the TSO, or because of payment delays or a payment default by the support counterparty. Of course, the off-taker of the TSO may not dispatch a plant if there are areas of congestion on the transmission system which limit the movement of power to the end user, or there's an emergency. However, it is important that there is certainty in the PPA in terms of whether, in terms of what is going to be compensated and whatnot. There are terms such as deemed energy, which is the energy that is considered to be generated by the producer, measured at a certain metering point. And one way to create certainty for or more clarity for producers is to define which events which events of curtailment are not going to be compensated, or if there's going to be a bank of an allowed percentage of energy or hours in the year where curtailment will be allowed without compensation, as well as defining what you use as the compensation level, be the PPA price or maybe the day-ahead price premium. We also see that compensation practices vary widely in Europe, but ultimately it is a matter of creating clarity for producers. In terms of off-taker liquidity support, in cases where this might be a risk, and again, this depends really on the market, but off-taker liquidity support through, for instance, a letter of credit issued in favor of the off-taker or bank guarantee equivalent to, I'm going to give a number, but the number really depends on the market, but maybe between 3 or 12 months of PPA revenues can also give investors more certainty that payments will be made for the energy generated. Next slide. Okay, this is another aspect that can affect project revenues, and is foreign exchange risk, which results from a currency mismatch between the buyer revenues in local currency, for instance, and the sellers or the producer's project financing, which is often in hard currency, especially if debt especially because if the local market is not very liquid, then debt is likely going to be obtaining hard currency. A full tariff indexation to hard currency has traditionally been the way to mitigate foreign exchange risk, but it is important to remember that this results in the buyer and by extension consumers assuming all of the currency depreciation costs, which can be quite considerable. So some markets might still require a full tariff indexation, but others not. I think the right intersection mix depends, among other things, on which project costs can be paid in local currency. For example, in some markets that might be operation and maintenance costs, and how developed local lending markets are to provide financing to renewable energy projects. Next slide. And I'm aware that this was a bit of a fast-paced turnaround, but we wanted to wrap up with some lessons learned on designing low-risk auctions. And one is to auction sufficiently large volumes, have schedules that create visibility for investors. In terms of support design, those that stabilize revenue, considering the electricity market, such as variable or fluctuating feed-in premiums, can increase certainty on future revenue streams for investors. We also learned that relaxing project requirements such as building permits or requiring lower bid bonds or lowering penalties does not create the benefit in terms of cost reduction that you would think, but rather might create unwanted effects such as lowering the probability that projects are built on time. And lastly, when we see that good auction design doesn't necessarily shield developers from all risks, because it's good to remember that the other side of the table, there are the consumers who are financing the support paid to producers. So it is really instead about helping parties correctly assess the risks involved in participating in an auction. And with this, I hand back over to you, Mac.
Yes, thank you very much. And in the end, before we go into the Q&A session, we would just like to stress that you can get all of the publications that we published within the AURES2 project including reports, scientific articles, and data by going to these links. As I understand, Leonardo Energy will share the presentation later on. So we would then like to go to the Q&A session now.